Hey everyone, this is Moderate Rebels. We are live on the Gray Zone YouTube. We are also live at Twitch. You can go to twitch.tv/the Gray Zone News, and we are live on Rockfin. We are speaking today with the geopolitical analyst and military expert Scott Ritter. He is a former United Nations weapons inspector who served in Iraq, and we can talk about his experience there. It turned him into a critic of the war in Iraq and of U.S. foreign policy. And Scott Ritter is also a former Marine Corps intelligence officer. And Scott, today there's a lot we want to talk about. I think the best thing to start with actually is that there's this democracy summit going on right now. Well, it was virtual in the United States. The Biden administration invited Ukraine, which might surprise people in Ukraine to learn that their government is a democracy, considering a lot of the opposition is currently in detention and critical media outlets were shut down. But we've seen escalation in the past several weeks. We've seen claims that by the U.S. government that Russia is planning to invade Ukraine. And Scott just published a really good article. I'll get it up here that goes through it kind of systematically and picks apart the claims about Russia's supposed invasion of Ukraine. Here's his article in RT. Russia's, quote, plan to invade Ukraine, end quote, exists only in the U.S. and NATO imagination. So I guess we can say, Scott, that you're pretty skeptical of what has been claimed about Ukraine in these past few weeks. Do you want to maybe summarize some of your main points and how are you doing?
Well, first of all, thanks for having me on. Well, let's just start with what does Russia gain from invading? I mean, war is the ultimate expression of national will, but it's an extension of politics. I mean, Clausewitz taught us that, and the idea that Russia would invade Ukraine for what purpose? Russia has no desire to, bring Ukraine into a greater Russia. That's not their objective. Russia has no desire to get bogged down in a 20-year insurgency. They know what will happen in Western Ukraine if Russian troops occupy that. It'd be perpetual warfare. And then the cost that Russia would pay for this. The United States has made it clear, if you invade Ukraine, there are going to be economic consequences. Now, I would assume that if Russia invades Ukraine, that it's already undertaken measures to deal with whatever economic sanctions the U.S. will put in. But still, it's going to be inconvenient for Russia. It's going to be disruptive for Russia. And so I have to ask myself, there's no reason for Russia to invade. What there is a reason for Russia to do is to prepare military force necessary to repel a Ukrainian offensive against Donbass or Crimea. And this is something that Russia is prepared and is preparing for. I mean, military professionals train all the time. When I was in the Marine Corps, we trained to fight Russia. We trained, the Soviet Union at that time. We trained to fight Iran. We trained to fight North Korea. We didn't go to war with any of them, but we trained. We were ready. If the balloon went up, we were going to get it on. And the Russians right now are looking at a very dangerous situation in Ukraine. You have a government led by a inexperienced politician who's failing at home. He's plummeting in the polls. He has domestic problems, and every politician that has a domestic political problem at home looks for a foreign policy, crisis to rally the troops. And his crisis is to latch on to, the eventual, recapture, so to speak, of Crimea, which will never happen. And then the reassertion of authority in the Donbass, which isn't going to happen either. Ukraine doesn't have the military power to do this. They have 165,000 active duty troops. They have around 200,000 reservists. They're not trained to a high level. They have some decent equipment, but I would give Ukraine 6 to 7 days max survivability in an all-out conflict with Russia. It would be over before it began. Everybody knows this, including the Ukrainians, including the United States, including NATO. Nobody wants to get involved. The bottom line is there's not an invasion being planned. Russia, first of all, understand a couple things. To invade Ukraine implies that Ukraine is on a defensive posture, and that Russia has to assemble enough offensive power to overcome 165,000 troops with 200,000 reservists. Normal military calculations are 3-to-1, meaning for every one defender, you have to have three people on offense. 365,000 is a big number. They're saying the Russians have 95,000, maybe 125,000 troops. That's not enough to launch an offensive operation against a prepared, defensive position. Now, if the Ukrainians go on the offensive, that changes the game, because now we have a mobile battle that the Russians excel in. They'll do deep mobile attacks, pinch off the Ukrainians, annihilate them. It'll be all over tomorrow, and you can do that with 125,000 troops. But that's a reactive military action. Again, I'll just make this as clear as possible. Russia is not preparing to invade Ukraine. There's no reason for Russia to do it. They're not assembling the forces necessary to do it. It just isn't going to happen. It exists in the imagination of the Ukrainians, of NATO, and of the United States. And I'll be frank, Ukrainians, NATO, and the United States know Russia isn't getting ready to invade. This is a manufactured crisis. This isn't something where people are just being extra cautious. They know Russia doesn't want to invade. They know Russia isn't preparing to invade. But they need to create the perception of a Russian threat so that they can overcome a wide array of problems. Like I said, Ukraine is dealing with serious domestic problems. NATO is dealing with a existential crisis, identity crisis. They just got booted out of Afghanistan, a humiliating defeat for all of NATO. And they're trying to figure out who they are and what they are. And they're allowing Poland and the Baltic states to define NATO, define what NATO stands for. And there's a lot of NATO members that aren't happy about this buildup. The United States, likewise, is a nation desperate for a reassertion of authority. The humiliating defeat in Afghanistan, coupled with Donald Trump's 4-year assault on the viability of NATO, has made the United States extremely sensitive to NATO insecurities. And so, you need a crisis, you need an enemy to rally the troops around. And they've picked Russia and they've picked Ukraine as the issue, but it's a artificial issue. It's a manufactured issue. Again, it could get real quick. I mean, if Ukraine does something precipitous, if they dare launch an attack into the Donbass, the Russians have made it clear that all bets are off. But this isn't a fight that Russia wants, and the fact that Vladimir Putin is showing so much patience, today is something that the United States should factor in. I mean, Putin is being extraordinarily patient with the United States, with NATO, with Ukraine. These aren't the actions of someone who's looking for a fight. These are the actions of somebody who is doing his best to avoid a fight.
Yeah, actually, William Burns, the CIA director, pretty much came out and said that the U.S. Does not actually believe that Russia is going to invade. But that was after the situation cascaded and reached a crisis point. He said U.S. intelligence has not concluded that, kind of cutting off at the knees Toria Newland, who fantasizes about setting up a Girl Scout cookie stand to feed Azov battalion neo-Nazis in Moscow's Red Square sometime in the future. Who seems to be one of the driving forces here in driving the crisis. But you quoted in your piece Joe Biden during his press conference after the call with Putin, and this was also stated in the readout, the idea that the U.S. is going to unilaterally use force to confront Russia invading Ukraine is not in the cards right now. So that's a significant statement in my view, because it has implications for whether Ukraine will ever be a part of NATO. It has implications for the possibility of Article 5, right? What is your take on that statement? Where did it come from, and what does it mean?
Well, it's a very important statement. It actually follows a similar statement made by Jens Stoltenberg, the Secretary General of NATO. Um, you know, put yourself in Biden's shoes right now, or even Stoltenberg's shoes. Basically, by playing this game of pretending that Ukraine will ever be a NATO member, Ukraine will never be a NATO member, ever. It will never qualify. It's the most corrupt nation, the most dysfunctional nation in Europe. They have a whole host of issues that they have to overcome before they can even be considered for NATO membership. It just isn't going to happen. Everybody knows this, except maybe the Ukrainians. Zelensky, the president, is desperate right now to get Western backing for his goal of reclaiming Crimea and the Donbass, and he thinks that and there's some talk in Ukraine that if they start a conflict with Russia, that will draw NATO and the United States in. And so now you're Biden and you're Stoltenberg, and you say, "My God, we've just given the trigger for war to a comedian lunatic." I mean, that's what it is. Basically, the man who now is in a position to destroy the world because a conflict with the United States and Russia could spin out of control very quick, isn't an American, and it isn't a member of NATO. It's this lunatic in Kiev.
Who played a president on TV.
I think Scott Ritter is frozen right now, or he's doing a very good job of being a mime.
Yeah, practicing his mime skills.
Our analytical power just went down by a lot.
Well, while we're waiting for,
why don't we,
yeah,
start it,
I mean,
bounce him out of the cast,
and
and
that too, because there's a lot of emphasis being put
hey,
on.
Scott, sorry, you cut out for a second.
I think
you cut out for a second. Go ahead.
Okay. What part did I cut out in? I don't want to be too repetitive.
You were talking about how Zelensky, the fate of the world is in the hands of this actor who played a president on TV.
Yeah, Zelensky has the trigger. He has his finger on the trigger. So Stoltenberg had to come out and quickly, set him straight that if Russia invades, there will be no NATO intervention. NATO only intercedes on behalf of members. Article 5 only applies to members, not friends, not acquaintances, not neighbors. And President Biden had to do the same thing, come out and make that similar statement, because, if you watch Jake Sullivan's press interview, I mean, Jake Sullivan sitting there saying, "We could send more troops to Europe." Really, Jake? Where are you going to get them? We could double the American presence in Europe. That means you go from 1 brigade to 2 brigades. You guys do know that Russia recently reconvened or reformed 2 combined arms armies: the 1st Guards Tank Army and the 20th Combined Arms Army. Anybody who was in the Cold War, like I was over in Europe, knew that those were the 2 formations that were, if we went to war, we're going to come in and kick our butt. Specialists in deep offensive operations. And because of the expansion of NATO eastward, because of the irresponsible behavior of the United States and NATO, Russia said, we got to bring these boys back. So what? The United States is now going to have 10,000 troops, 380 tanks, facing off against 120,000 troops and around 1,200 tanks. That's a fight that's just going to be over in moments. So I think Biden listened to Sullivan and said, "Whoa, people might get the wrong impression. Like Ukraine might get the wrong impression that if Russia invades, American troops are going to be deployed." And he had to go on record and say no, because let's remember this: the United States knows Russia isn't going to invade. Trust me, but Biden has been briefed. They're not going to invade. Why did Biden do this? Because Biden can't be seen as being weak with Russia, but Biden also understands that he's backed himself into a corner. He has to find a vehicle, a means where he can actually sit down and engage with the Russians without being seen as capitulating to Russia. So they've created this crisis. It gives Biden the chance to have Jake Sullivan say, "He looked me in the eyes. I looked Putin in the eyes, and I told Putin there will be serious consequences if you invade Ukraine." We know they're not going to invade. Russia doesn't want to invade, but we're going to pretend you want to invade, and there will be serious consequences for this thing we know you're not going to do. And those consequences will be economic sanctions like you've never seen before, although we can't do it because Europe will freeze to death and we'll have a gas crisis, and that'll be the end of my presidency. But let's
Well,
pretend
and there
I'm
already
gonna
is
put
a gas crisis. So,
yeah,
I mean,
it's just stupid. But then he said we're going to put more troops in, and I think the Ukrainians listened to that and went, "That's what we want, boss." And so Biden quickly had to set it straight. But what came out of this meeting? We're now going to sit down with the Russians. We're now going to listen to their concerns about a larger framework about European security. And how are we predicating this? Biden just said Ukraine ain't going to be a member for NATO. We're not even going to consider Ukrainian membership for 10 years. Trust me, they'll never be members. But now there won't even be a discussion about that. So that buys a window of time to take the pressure off. And I think that's an important statement. And so Putin came out of this meeting with everything he wanted. I mean, it's a great victory for Putin, but it's also a victory for Biden because Biden was in a quandary. He has to be tougher on Russia than Donald Trump. He can't come out and do the responsible thing because he'll get eviscerated by Congress and the talking heads on the U.S. media. So he has to pretend he's a tough guy. He manufactures a crisis. He comes up with punishments for actions that'll never occur. So it's all fiction. And the only real thing that occurred is that we're demanding Ukraine comply with Minsk II, which is what the Russians wanted. And we're telling the Ukrainians, you can't be a member of NATO for at least 10 years, which makes the Russians happy. So the Russians got everything, and Biden avoided having a madman in Kiev pull the trigger on potential nuclear conflict.
well, yeah, and Scott, I think there was another really significant development here. We saw that this, I mean, we should just make it clear when you say that the U.S. government knows that Russia's not going to invade. There was basically a fake news campaign that was trying to push up all this pressure on Russia, which got Putin to agree to a virtual summit with Biden. And I'll put up some photos of the summit. They're pretty incredible because Putin is sitting there alone, but Biden is sitting there surrounded by his advisors, which it's very clear that they were managing Biden to make sure that he doesn't say anything too soft on Russia, and he was reading from prepared comments. But all this pressure was used to leverage. They leveraged this pressure to agree to a virtual summit, and in the summit, Biden basically confirmed that Ukraine will not be a member of NATO, and Putin made a very interesting comment, and I think this is the first time that Putin has made a public demand that the U.S. agree to, or rather that NATO as a whole agree to stop expanding eastward. We know that in the 1980s that Gorbachev made an agreement with NATO to not expand an inch east after the reunification of Germany, and actually reneged on that agreement, continued to expand east. But I believe this is the first time that Putin has ever publicly demanded that NATO agree to sign an agreement saying not to expand eastward. I mean, that's a pretty significant development that came out of this as well.
No, it's a huge development. Look, NATO's in a quandary. I mean, Putin can make these demands because he senses a weakness, and B, from that weakness, a readiness to look for an alternative than the path that NATO's on. In the 1980s, when I was in the military, all we did is train to fight the Russians. That's all we did. We had 310,000 troops in Europe. We were prepared to deploy another 250,000 troops on 10 days' notice to reinforce them. And we practiced large-scale warfare, combined arms warfare. It's time-consuming. It's intensive in terms of operations. It's expensive. And then the Cold War ended, and then we got involved in this 20-year misadventure in the Middle East, where all we did is low-intensity conflict, and we've forgotten how to fight big wars. We don't have the muscle memory anymore. We're not equipped to do it. We're not armed to do it. We're not trained to do it. We don't have the doctor to do it. The Russians do. And so if we want to play this game where we're going to pretend that we're going to be prepared to confront Russia in the ground war in Europe, we're going to need more than words. We're going to need all of Europe to rearm back to the level that they were in the 1980s. That's going to cost trillions of dollars. Europe doesn't have that money to spend. The United States doesn't have that money to spend. I mean, we spend enough money as it is. It's funny, $760 billion plus probably. And we can't scrape together another heavy armored brigade for Europe. We used to be able to fight 2.5 wars. Now I don't think we can fight a half war. It's just, and everybody knows this. I mean, this is not a secret. Every military professional knows this. You can have all the, studs from the global war on terror pound their chest and talk about how great they are kicking down doors and terrorizing civilians and putting $1 million missiles into goat herders' tents. Yay. We lost that war, by the way. But now you try and tell these guys, no, now you got to stand up with somebody who's been spending the last 20 years preparing to fight you. They have the best tanks. They have the best artillery. They have the best tactics. They know what they're doing. There's a reason why Russia puts 90,000 troops in the field, because if you're going to practice large-scale combined arms maneuvering, you need 90,000 troops. We can't put 90,000 troops in the field. We don't practice this stuff. Back in the Cold War, we put 125,000 in the field and practice in Europe because that's the war we were preparing to fight. I don't think we can scrape 125,000 troops together right now. So, NATO needs a way out, and the way out is to do what Putin is demanding. I mean, Putin's demands are diplomatically couched, but the reality is this isn't just Russia saying something that's to the benefit of Russia. This is Putin saying something that's to the benefit of all of Europe. I mean, there's one adult in the room right now, and his name is Vladimir Putin.
Yeah, at least there's one adult who isn't kind of like wandering aimlessly around the White House, drooling at a wall. I mean, it's getting a little bit disturbing out there. Although I will say that, Biden can be sometimes a more reassuring presence than the neocon blob creatures that are surrounding him. But I wanted to ask about one.
Well, really quickly, Max. That's why I mentioned that at this Biden summit, with this virtual summit with Putin, if you look at the photo, it's really revealing that the photo of Biden, he's surrounded. I'm trying to get this photo up here. Here we go. This is the photo of Biden on the call. If you look at the photo of Putin, it's just him alone. But Biden is surrounded by his handlers. It's clear they don't even let him speak. And I mean, clearly, I think part of that is because they're worried that his mental health is bad enough that he might say something crazy. But look at this. It's clear that they're also, Jake Sullivan is there. Anthony Blinken is there.
That seems to, I mean, I'll let Scott say what Scott would know more than me, but that's pretty standard to have your national security team, your kitchen cabinet with you. And remember, there was the whole freak out over Donald Trump meeting personally with Putin without a translator. It meant that he could have cut a secret deal to allow Moscow to take over the United States.
So I don't doubt that it's common, but this is the photo of Putin. I mean, just alone. So I don't know. To me, the difference between
there is a study in contrast.
Yeah, I mean, it really shows that Biden is being micromanaged by all of these war hawks. And I mean, not that I think he's some dove, but it shows how like, even if Biden wanted better relations with Russia, all of the people like Blinken and Sullivan would never allow it.
So it's like a one-on-one meeting, but it was like Biden was like the P5+1 or like the N5+1, like the 5 neocons in him. But
let's be serious though, because right next door to Putin was a conference room where Lavrov and Ushakov and all of his advisors were sitting watching the same thing. It's just that, I've been in the White House Situation Room. That's just the way it's set up. I'm not a fan of Joe Biden. I'm here to criticize him at every step possible. But that photo op I don't think we should read too much into it. I think Max is dead on. That's just the way we do business. Obama did business that way. Trump, when he was doing business, did business that way. Every American president sits in the Situation Room with his principals there. That's just the way we do business. I do think that, Biden, we have, I think the staff monitors him very carefully because, to make sure that he stays on point. I mean, and you would do that 20 years ago. I mean, Joe Biden is famous for just going off on ad libs,
about his yellow leg hairs.
It was the CFR talk that really did a lot of damage to Biden because he talked about how he removed the attorney general in Kiev. It was a classic example of Biden saying too much, and he was with Michael Carpenter, his handler, and he still, ran off at the mouth. So it isn't just senility; it's classic.
Or at Harvard, he gave a talk, and in the Q&A, he admitted that U.S. allies were supporting Al Qaeda and ISIS in Syria, and that it was a big problem, and then he had to issue an apology.
Well, to my question, about a development today, I don't even know if it's a development. I'm not sure if this is real, and that's what I wanted to ask you, Scott. There was some talk in Washington about a possible deal over the Donbass region, actually settling this. Something that would have been completely impossible in the Trump administration. I mean, it would have fueled the Russiagate hysteria enormously. And Jen Psaki has denied it, but there's been talk that the Biden administration is actually pushing Zelensky to give up Luhansk and Donetsk. What do you think about
Well,
this?
it's not give up. I mean, the Biden administration is pushing Zelensky
to give them
adhere
status,
Give
to the
political autonomy.
Yeah, well, that we've already agreed to that. That's what Minsk 2 is all about. Minsk 2,
right,
is about autonomy, giving autonomy to
Scott,
Donbass and Lugansk.
If I'm not mistaken, I think the language in Minsk 2 calls for decentralization, which I guess in this sense would mean autonomy.
Yeah, and this is one of Russia's big demands, that this has to happen. And everybody keeps saying, well, Russia's a party to the Minsk. No, they're not. Russia's not a party at all. They're a moderator. They're an observer. They're interested. But you can't say that Russia's violating Minsk too, because Russia's not. There's nothing for Russia to do, and they're just sit back and say Ukraine has to provide enhanced, whatever you called it. I call it autonomy to Donbass. And this again was one of Putin's demands during the video conference with Biden. He said, you guys got to do this, or else this is going to go on forever, and we're not going to let it go on forever. And so Biden now is putting pressure on Ukraine, saying, it's put up or shut up time. Are you serious about resolving this issue? Because if you're not, then we have to re-examine the totality of our relationship with you. So, like I said, Putin got a lot out of this summit. I mean, everybody in the American media is talking about how he got a tongue lashing by steely-eyed Joe. Putin doesn't care about our threats of sanctions. Like I said, we're threatening an action in response to something Russia isn't going to do. So Putin's not even going to waste a moment's sleep on this. We're not going to put troops in because we don't have any troops to put in. Russia holds all the cards, and we see that right now because Biden is literally dancing to Russia's tune. Literally, that's what's happening, and it's important. I mean, look, I maybe I should tone it down because the last thing I want to do is create a window of political vulnerability for Biden. I think Biden needs to ride this "I'm a tough guy" wave as long as he can, so he can tell Congress how tough he was with Putin, so he can get on TV and tell people how he looked him in the eye and was tough, how Putin wet his diapers. I mean, something like that. But at the end of the day, fiction is what Biden will be talking about. Reality is what Putin's getting. And the reality is the United States is telling that Ukraine won't be a NATO member for at least 10 years. And they're saying that, Ukraine has to adhere to Minsk 2, which will give Donbass and Lugansk autonomy. And that's all Russia wants. Now, the next thing they'll get after that is, they'll put a compliant government in Kiev because Zelensky won't survive this. And they'll get the Ukrainians to admit that Crimea is Russia. And once Ukraine says Crimea belongs to Russia, the United States and NATO don't have a leg to stand on. And that's Putin's strategy in the long term.
Yeah, and I'm glad you brought up Minsk too. I mean, it's funny, it's almost never discussed, even though this was an agreement that was officially voted on at the United Nations Security Council, which makes it part of international law. And of course, the U.S., which has veto power at the UN Security Council, allowed Minsk 2 to go through. So I mean, the U.S. Technically is supposed to abide by Minsk 2, or at least pressure Ukraine to abide by Minsk 2. But the propaganda we constantly see in the Beltway, here's the Atlantic Council, one of the most hawkish voices in D.C., which has a very important role in helping to push East European policy. Here's an article. Russia, not Ukraine, is serial violator of ceasefire. And they're talking about Minsk 2. But really quickly, just getting it up, I mean, it's important to just look at the text. It's not even that long of an agreement. Here's the text of Minsk 2 at the website New Cold War. And here's the specific language. It calls for constitutional reform in Ukraine, calling for a new constitution by the end of 2015, a very long time ago. The key element of which is decentralization, taking into account Donetsk and Luhansk. And then they also say they call for the implementation of local self-governance in Donetsk and Luhansk. These were never implemented. And then, ironically, while the Western media constantly blames Russia for violating, or well, they accuse Russia of being involved in the conflict, which Russia says that it's not, of course. I mean, Russia is supporting the Donetsk and Luhansk People's Republics, but they constantly blame Russia for violations of Minsk II. But meanwhile, we've even seen reports recently, I don't know if you know much about this, Scott, that Ukraine, not only is it receiving Western military shipments, which also violates Minsk II, but Ukraine has recently been using Turkish drones to attack the Donbass, which is another violation of Minsk II.
Yeah, and I'll tell you what, again, that's part of the escalation that drives responsible parties in NATO and in the American national security establishment crazy. Because there's, if Ukraine wants to fire off a couple of mortars, a couple artillery shells, and kill a couple civilians in Donbass and Lugansk, as tragic as it is for the civilians, I'm not making light of it, but Russia can ride that out. They have been, and actually Russia will spin that to their advantage. But once Ukraine starts using drones and using them effectively, this is a red line for Russia. And the Russians, if you want to get a Russian response that makes you say ouch, use a drone against a target that means something to Russia. It's an escalation of technology that is impermissible. Not only is it a violation of Minsk, but it's just impermissible from Russian national security. I mean, we wouldn't, we tolerate Mexican drug cartels coming over and shooting up the streets every now and then in the United States, but we sure as hell wouldn't let them, get a fighter jet and start bombing strategic targets. We take the hurt to Mexico real quick if that occurred. And trust me, if Ukraine starts feeling a little frisky and uses one of these Turkish drones in a creative way, Russia's going to put the hurt on them. It's a very dangerous situation.
Yeah, we might let them drop some bags of cocaine from a drone if the CIA was profiting, though. I should just say, let's keep the focus on Donbass. Vladimir Putin said that what is happening there looks like genocide, and that Russophobia is the first step to genocide. What is the perspective of the Russian-speaking population in eastern Ukraine? What did Putin mean by this, and how is this fueling or informing the conflict?
Well, I mean, first of all, let's back up and let's talk about the history here.
Yeah, definitely.
When we speak of the Soviet Union, my wife is from the former Soviet Union, by the way, and there was a multitude of ethnicities that had loyalty to Moscow ostensibly, but you also had Russians living in various republics where they weren't viewed as foreigners; they were viewed as fellow citizens. You had Russians living in Georgia, Russians living in Tajikistan, Kazakhstan, etc. And then you also had areas like Ukraine and Belarus in the Baltic republics that had extensive, native Russian populations, people that didn't have to just move there; they've been living there forever, and they're Russian. They're not Ukrainian. They're Russian. They're Russian nationality. And when the Soviet Union fell, literally not 100, but tens of millions of Russians became homeless. And this was the national tragedy that Putin spoke of. He said it's just irresponsible for a government to inflict that kind of damage on its own people. And Russia has been working ever since then to protect these Russian populations. And it's not a matter of saying that if you have a Russian on your territory, you have to have fealty to Moscow. What it's saying is you need to respect the cultural heritage of these Russians. You have to allow them to practice their religion. You have to allow them to speak their language. You have to allow them to celebrate their history. And much of that history that they're talking about celebrating is the history of the Great Patriotic War, World War II, the Soviet Union's victory over Nazi Germany. You know, much of those battles were fought on Ukraine soil, and Belarusian soil, and in the Baltics. And so, you know, Putin is very sensitive to the plight of these Russians. And so when the Maidan revolt took place, and you had these Western Ukrainian, supporters of, Makhno, and other Nazis, suddenly talking about, we're going to have only the Ukrainian language. We're going to suppress the Russian language. The Russian population was very concerned, and Putin became very concerned. And this is why Russia has intervened so decisively in Donbass. I mean, Putin can say till he's blue in the face that there aren't any Russian troops there. We know there's Russian troops there. We know Russian officers are embedded in the various militias. We know that the Russian intelligence service is very much involved. We know that Russia has provided modern equipment, and we know that the Russian army is sitting there to provide fire support at a moment's notice. That's just what you would expect if you're protecting an indigenous Russian people. Putin also understands that these madmen and women from Western Ukraine are the same ones who were capable of murdering hundreds of thousands of Jews, of murdering Poles, of murdering Romanians, murdering Hungarians, murdering Russians. Anybody who wasn't, a Western Ukrainian could be, put to the sword, so to speak. And all it takes is for Russia to drop its guard, for passions to run high, and the Azov battalion becomes the Azov division, and it goes into Lugansk and Donbass. It rounds up the men, and we now have, Srebrenica, but on a larger scale. This isn't fantasy. This is reality. These are some really sick people in Ukraine, and Russia, Putin, when he says genocide, he doesn't really mean genocide, because it's not, but it's the potential for genocide. There's no doubt that there is the potential for genocide if these neo-Nazi Ukrainian nationalists are able to dictate policy. And again, once bullets start flying, civilization goes out the window. That's just the way it is. And
I'm playing some videos.
I'm
playing some video, Scott, on screen right now, and this is from April of this year. This is a swastika, a Nazi flag, the flag of the German Third Reich, that was flown from the Ukrainian army's position in the Donbass. And this is what the Russian-speaking population was looking at from the other side. And this was right after Vladimir Zelensky had visited this position with a helmet on, just to illustrate your point.
Well, and Max, I'm glad you got that up. I was about to get up. Here's an article. After years, we've known this for years. We've reported on it, but there's finally some more mainstream coverage. Here's the Ottawa Citizen in Canada. Here's an article. Canadian officials who met with Ukrainian unit linked to neo-Nazis feared exposure by news media. And they're, of course, talking about the Azov battalion. And Max and I have reported at the Gray Zone, and other people like Mark Ames have been reporting for years, that U.S. and Canadian military officials and other Western military officials have been meeting with people in the Azov battalion, which was incorporated into the Ukrainian National Guard. And I remember until like the last year or two, if you ever talked about this, you were called a Russian propagandist. But finally, I think the Atlantic Council finally published an article like 2 or 3 years ago saying, yeah, there are Nazis in Ukraine. It's not all just Russian propaganda. I mean, because it just became so obvious they couldn't deny it anymore.
Now they just say we're pro-Russian propagandists, but
one thing that bothers me as a former military officer is that we have defense attachés over there who get sucked into these traps. I'm sure they don't intend to do this, but they go out on these frontline tours. And they get the briefings by the heroic Ukrainian forces, and invariably embedded around them are not, and they're wearing the symbology of the neo-Nazis, and that the United States, who Germany. 200 men give their lives in that conflict in Europe, and now we have serving officers, United States military, standing side by side with these Nazis, as if we're in a joint endeavor to confront the evil Russians. It's humiliating. It's embarrassing. It's unprofessional. And I'm sickened that we haven't put a stop to this.
Well, here you have, I threw up on this on screen because this was also from April. I tweeted about it. This is U.S. Embassy attaché Colonel Brittany Stewart, who is paying tribute to Vasily Slepak, who is a right sector leader, leader of Pravdy sector, which is a neo-fascist kind of antecedent to the Azov battalion. And she's wearing a Ukraine or death badge on her uniform. I mean, you can see it right here. This is, fascist insignia. And this is a U.S. official in the field. So, I mean, you're not just you're not exaggerating. This is shocking stuff.
We did lose Scott. So while we try to get him back here, I also want to point out, here is the article in the Atlantic Council. Hilarious. 2018. Ukraine's got a real problem with far-right violence. And no, RT didn't write this headline. I mean, because after years of ignoring the neo-Nazis in Ukraine, they finally admit it, but have to couch it in this ridiculous qualifier.
Yeah, I think it's become impossible to ignore. We've even seen Bellingcat investigations on Nazism in Ukraine. These are the same people who demonized us. And, while we talk about Donbass, everyone should check out our interview with Russell Bentley, who is an American military veteran and just all around American renegade who actually went to fight with the Russian-speaking forces there in defense of his socialist beliefs against these fascist forces. So I really recommend that to hear what it's like on the ground. I see Scott is back with us, so let's get him back in the stream.
I got my computer on, so hopefully that will help with the quality of the
much
broadcast.
better. It's slightly green. It's kind of arcade green, but
yeah.
old 80s arcade games are cool now. They have like bars in Brooklyn. Yeah, it's retro. So let's talk about Ukraine a little bit. The situation inside Ukraine. They are facing an energy crisis or a huge threat from Nord Stream 2 and its completion. Their economy is collapsing. Corruption is through the roof. Zelensky is unpopular, and he's been shutting down TV stations that are critical of him with the State Department. The State Department's full-throated endorsement. How would you assess the situation inside Ukraine, and how did that drive this crisis to the point that we're at right now?
Well, I think we have to look back on history and understand that Ukraine is an artificial nation. When it was part of the Soviet Union, it didn't function as as an independent nation. It functioned as a part of a larger system. It provided industrial support. It provided agricultural support. It provided manpower for the military, but it wasn't designed to function on its own. And then suddenly Ukraine becomes independent, and you have a nation that is striving to be something it's not built to be. And then you combine that with the corruption. I mean, when I was with the United Nations in Iraq, I actually dealt with Ukraine because we had a situation where Ukrainians were exploiting their industrial base and trying to sell weapons technology to Iraq, who was desperate for that kind of stuff. And so I had to travel to Kiev, and I remember going to Kiev, and I was meeting with the National Security Council of them in the president's office, and how fractured it was. I mean, you had one faction saying, well, you can't talk to these guys because they're all being bought off by the industrialists. You have the other guys saying, no, they're in the pockets of the oligarchs. And then you had the oligarchs saying, hey, don't talk to the government because we're calling all the shots. The government has no power. And that's just the way it is. You had these corrupt individuals go in and buy up state enterprises, and then use them to enrich themselves. I mean, you have a situation in Ukraine where you can go to the home of one of these billionaires, and it's unlike anything you've ever seen. And yet, surrounding him is abject third world poverty, with no streets. The only streets that get paved are the ones that he gets to drive his Porsche 928 or Lamborghini Countach S on, to go to this private airstrip, because he doesn't go to airports. I mean, no, he goes to his private airstrip with his private Gulfstream, and everything revolves around them. That's Ukraine. That's the reality of Ukraine. And it's also a nation that it's three distinct nations. You have Western Ukraine, which are really Poles, who hate Eastern Ukrainians and hate Russians. They want to go to war against these guys. You have the Russians in Eastern Ukraine who identify more with Russia than do with Ukraine. And then you have these centrist Ukrainians who, sort of, even though they understand that they're ethnically different than the Russians, they aspire to be part of a greater Russia because they're used to the efficiency that comes out of Moscow. I mean, imagine saying that. We always criticize the Soviets and the Cold War as being an inefficient government. But I'll tell you what, compared to what's going on in Kiev right now, Soviet bureaucracy is a smooth functioning machine. No, it's a dysfunctional country. I mean, where else can you have a comedian with no political experience be bankrolled by an oligarch who uses media outlets, TVs, newspapers to promote his candidacy, all paid for by the oligarch, and then he becomes president and passes a law that says oligarchs aren't allowed to get involved in politics. Oligarchs can't own media stations. Oligarchs can't do things. And then he's surprised that the oligarchs have revolted against him. I mean, it's just a crazy situation in Ukraine.
That would be Igor Kolomoisky, who is the big backer of Zelensky. I mean, it really sounds kind of like an American situation, like a reality TV host who gets backed by an oligarch and winds up president, but a little bit even possibly even more cartoonish there. Ben, you want to weigh in with anything?
Yeah, I mean, on the subject of poverty, this is not that well known, but I think it's really important. This is an article at this media outlet that was actually ironically shut down by Zelensky, Kiev Post, which among Ukrainian media outlets, it was actually pretty pro-Western and pretty anti-Russian, but it wasn't anti-Russian enough for Zelensky. So with the full backing of the Western so-called democracies, he shut down Kiev Post. This is an article they published back in 2020. 45% of Ukrainians will fall below actual poverty level in 2020. Almost half of Ukrainians. This is one of the poorest countries in Europe, and that almost never gets addressed. And not even just that, but the massive number of Ukrainians who have been displaced. And it's not a coincidence that where are the countries that all have the largest refugee and internally displaced populations? It's Syria, Iraq, Afghanistan, and also now Ukraine, Yemen. It's the countries that are destabilized by these Western-backed wars. And the damage that has been done to Ukrainian society is incredible, and it's never discussed by all of these neocons in Washington who treat Ukraine as like this civilizational mission, but don't actually care about the Ukrainian people. I mean, it's the ultimate irony because they accuse Russia, they project onto Russia of what they're doing, which is destroying the livelihood of millions of Ukrainians.
No, it's absolutely true. Now we'll bring in the issue of energy. Ukraine is a nation that is totally dependent upon Russia for natural gas and oil. They do have coal mines, but in terms of natural gas, Ukraine's dependent on it. But not just that, the income derived from the transit fees that are paid by Russian natural gas being flowed to Europe is $3 to $5 billion a year, and one would think that, hey, that's a nice chunk of change that I can use to help out the citizens of Ukraine, especially these 45% who are poverty stricken. But Zelensky made a telling statement. He said, "We can't afford our military if we lose this money, meaning that this money is not being used for the Ukrainian people. This money is being used to buy arms, equipment, and to pay troops to fight the Russians, whose gas has to flow through this pipeline in order for him to get the money. I mean, he gets the money from Russia. So Russia is funding Ukrainian defense today. I mean, that's one of the weird things about this. This is why Nord Stream 2 makes sense for Russia, because, you know, what nation would sit there and say, yeah, we're going to give you $5 billion a year so you can build a war machine with whose singular focus is to fight us? It's stupid. But again, it just shows you the level of dysfunction that exists in Ukraine today. It is not a nation state that's capable of standing on its own. You eliminate the Russian gas, you eliminate the Western largesse, and you have a nation state that will collapse within weeks. And this is the Russian strategy. I mean, at the end of the day, Russia will exploit the fact when that poverty level, you know, tips past 50%, gets into the 55%, 60%, it's all she wrote. Ukrainians who sat there in Maidan and screamed about, you know, oh, anti-Russia, will be begging the Russians to come to their aid. And they will, not by invading, not by occupying, by putting back in place a pro-Russian government that will work with Russia to better the livelihood of the Ukrainian citizens. You know, the EU is not doing that. You don't see the European Union helping the average Ukrainian. They're too busy trying to, you know, prop up the government with weaponry. Same thing with the United States. Imagine if we converted all these billions of dollars we're giving them in free weapons, and we turned that into, you know, societal betterment programs. The Ukrainian people might actually want to be part of the West, but, you know, Zelensky doesn't represent the average Ukrainian. There's a lot of resentment in Ukraine right now, not to Russia, but to the West, because they recognize what the source of all evil is in Ukraine. And that's, you know, Western ambition to contain Russia using Ukraine as a tool of containment. We needed this crisis in Ukraine to justify the continued expansion of NATO, not just physically, but also, you know, to get NATO members to increase their defense spending so that they can beef up their forces. You know, if it weren't for Ukraine, you know, we wouldn't be able to justify all of this. And who's paying the price for all of this, you know, geopolitical brinksmanship? Mom and dad Ukrainian. And it's going to reach a boiling point soon. And it'll be all she wrote for not just Zelensky, but for any anti-Russian politician. Not because the Russians say so, because the Ukrainian people say so.
Yeah, and actually, I wanted to show these are official statistics from the European Union. I mean, it's incredible because right now there's a gas and energy crisis when the winter is starting. And I mean, how many people are going to go cold, and how many people are going to have to pay insane rates for their energy, for their heat in their houses? Meanwhile, here's the European Union's official statistics on energy. They say Russia is the main EU supplier of crude oil, natural gas, and solid fossil fuels. And it shows this is solid fuel, that's coal. 47% of EU imported coal comes from Russia. Only 18% comes from the US. Here is natural gas. This is according to 2019. This is as of 2019. 41% of imports of natural gas to the EU come from Europe. 16% come from Norway. 8% come from Algeria, 5% from Qatar. This is again in 2019. EU imports of crude oil, 27% come from Russia. And then all under 10%, you have Iraq, Nigeria, Saudi Arabia. So the country that is preventing the people in the European Union from like going through the winter without heat is Russia. And they keep, worsening their diplomatic relations with Russia and threatening to isolate Russia economically and cut it out of the SWIFT system. Ironically, here's another article from Bloomberg. This is almost never discussed by geopolitical analysts, but I think especially in Western corporate media where you don't even have geopolitical analysis. But here's an article from August 2021 in Bloomberg. Russia captures number 2 rank among foreign oil suppliers to the U.S. Russia is supplying more oil to the U.S. than any other foreign producer aside from Canada. So while NATO member states, the US and the EU, are basically threatening a kind of war with Russia, they're at one of their worst points of diplomatic relations with Russia in decades. They're also at a record level of importing gas and oil from Russia. I mean, it's so crazy. It doesn't make any sense. And now, you mentioned earlier that NATO has said pretty clearly that it will, if there is a conflict, an escalation of the armed conflict in Ukraine, in the Donbass, that NATO is not going to send troops. Instead, the U.S. has said that it will increase sanctions, and Victoria Nuland has said very explicitly that they will remove Russia from the SWIFT system. So, okay, if they remove Russia from the SWIFT system, where are they going to buy all of their oil and gas from?
Well,
they can't buy from Venezuela, because the U.S. did import it from Venezuela, and they replaced the Venezuelan oil with Russian oil.
I know you're not here right now, Ben, in the U.S. You're in Managua, but gas prices are really low, and people are so excited that they're cheering on this guy who they hold responsible for low gas prices, named Brandon. They're all out there chanting, "Let's go, Brandon!" So things are going great here. We don't need that oil.
Brandon, Missouri is the #1 tourist spot in America. Apparently, everybody's talking about it. Look, here's the deal, and again, Biden knows this. He's not a stupid man. I don't like him. I have no respect for him, but he's not stupid. And the people who are advising him aren't stupid. They're not clever, but they're not stupid. I'll just say this is as simple a statement as say, Russia can survive longer without the SWIFT system than Europe and the United States can survive without Russian energy. So if you want to play the game of we're going to cut off SWIFT and we're going to sanction your energy, first of all, Europe will crumble. They will divorce themselves from the United States instantly. They will be crawling to Russia, begging for a renewal of these energy contracts. If the quickest way to get rid of SWIFT globally is for the United States to do something precipitous like this, because right now the world is furious at the United States because of what we call secondary sanctions. That is, we use the SWIFT system and the linkage with the American banking system as leverage to allow the United States to pass laws that sanction people. They have no validity under international law, but it doesn't matter. If Congress passes a sanction that says, if you do business with Iran through the SWIFT system, we can sanction you. And the United States has been able to leverage this successfully to keep people from doing things that are permissible under international law, but not permissible under U.S. law. But the Trump's withdrawal from the JCPOA highlighted the vulnerability of Europe and the rest of the world to this. And so you have people looking to come up with alternatives. But as long as the SWIFT system is functioning, you don't want to mess with it. The world operates on a very razor-thin margin of efficiency. That's capitalism for you. We don't like to have surpluses. We don't like to have things reserved sitting there. We want our profit margins to be as big as possible, so we seek efficiency. We need to get just enough to market to sell at the right prices, etc. That's great if everything's working fine. Cut off Russian energy, and this efficiency margin suddenly becomes a deficiency in efficiency. What I mean is nothing will work. We won't have any goods in the store. We won't have trucks moving anything. You think you have a supply chain crisis now? Cut off Russian oil, and the whole thing will shut down. And at that point, the SWIFT system becomes a liability. People will stop trading in the dollar. Russia and China will say, no, we want to basically do a ruble for euro trade, or whatever the yuan for yen. But it will go back to trading in national currencies. And if you take the dollar off the international market as the international currency of trade, the United States will, the bubble will pop. It's over. So I laugh every time I hear the Victoria Nulands and the Jake Sullivans and the Tony Blinkens, all these tough people, at the desk, but they've never done anything tough in their life. Talk about how they're going to sanction Russia. You're not going to sanction Russia. Not at all. Russia knows this. Russia's prepared. Like I said, Russia has a plan in place to survive without SWIFT, and they will survive. The United States does not have a plan in place to survive without Russian oil. Europe doesn't have a plan in place to survive without Russian gas. So, and Putin knows this. He's not stupid. So he just has to sit there and chuckle every time Biden looks him in the eyes and threatens sanctions. Putin just chuckling, going, yeah, no, you're not. It's just not going to happen because it can't happen. You've seen the data. It can't happen. It will be the end of the American economy, the end of the European economy. The nations, they'll be inconvenient, but the nations that'll best, come out of this, China and Russia. So if we want to accelerate Chinese global dominance, sanction Russia.
Well, the U.S. has done a great job of bringing China and Russia together.
Yeah, the best of friends.
They're almost a block. I mean, you could almost say that we're not in a multipolar world. It's almost a bipolar world in the way that the U.S. has rendered its perceived opposition so cohesive against all of the conflicts and rifts of history. And I think here would be a good point to transition to the international Zoom conference that's known as
Max, before we go really quickly, I just wanted to point out, because this point that Scott was making is so important. We've had on Professor Michael Hudson, a great economist, who has talked about the process of economic decoupling. And he constantly points that the more and more the U.S. imposes sanctions on Russia and China, it further decouples their economies from the U.S. economy, which weakens the U.S. economy. And I wanted to point out, Scott mentioned secondary sanctions. It reminded me of this decision by the Trump administration. This is an article in the New York Times back in 2019. U.S. moves to stop all nations from buying Iranian oil. And if you look at the list, this is from 2019 again. The U.S. was telling many of its own allies that they would face secondary sanctions if they continued doing business with Iran. Specifically, that was India, Japan, South Korea, and all Turkey. I mean, Turkey at this point is kind of a frenemy, but you saw the Trump administration threaten sanctions on India, Japan, and South Korea. So, I mean, if the U.S. is threatening sanctions on South Korea and Japan, I mean, what are they going to do? They're going to say, okay, fine, we'll do business with China and Russia. It is such a suicidal policy. And all I'll say is just like, I guess just keep on doing it, because it's actually accelerating the decline of U.S. hegemony so rapidly.
It is, but I have to say, as somebody who lives here in the United States, I'm not a fan of the collapse of the American economy. I enjoy the security I have right now. I enjoy knowing that my wife has a roof over her head. I can put food on the table. All of that goes away, and this is where the average American needs to wake up, because we've wrapped ourselves in this cocoon of consumer-based comfort without understanding how that actually got there. And we've dumbed ourselves down. As long as the government keeps us in this cocoon of comfort, we're willing just to sit there and be, rocked to sleep every night. That cocoon's going to break open pretty soon, and we're going to be out in the world where there's going to be a bunch of birds trying to eat us. And this is just fact. And probably need to turn that off at some point. But I think I just hung up on Cy Hirsch, just so you know.
Tell him I said hi.
I will, but I have to turn this down here. Poor Cy.
He's really hard for us
winner.
It's hard for us to reach. So.
Well, I could put him on and he could he could talk to you, but no. But the bottom line is, the American people have no clue what's going on right now, and they don't understand how fragile this consumer-based lifestyle is that we're living in. And this comfort can go away really quick. I mean, there was a time when the Ukrainians lived in relative comfort, and now 45% of them are at the poverty level, and that can be us very soon. And I just hope people understand how fragile this is, and maybe that can awaken American democracy in a way that it hasn't, because the only way democracy works is for the people to become informed about issues and then vote accordingly, select the right people for office instead of simply ticking off boxes attached to names that have been pre-selected by somebody else. So who knows? Maybe this could be the best thing that happened to American democracy, and then we don't have to worry about Joe Biden having to hold a summit for democracy. We can have our own little summit for democracy here at home.
So I guess you won't be happy if you own nothing in the Great Reset. But I was trying to transition to get your thoughts on the Summit of Democracies. I was actually listening to you on Soviet radio earlier today, talking about it on Sputnik.
Well, Max, you joke, but Lloyd Austin, the defense secretary, recently referred to Russia as the Soviet Union.
Yeah, that's so. That really does highlight the mentality. But you know what was the point of what was Guitar God and Secretary of State Tony Blinken thinking when he convened this? What's the strategy or the strategery there? And
strategery,
as George W. Bush famously said. And what was the outcome? Was there any? Was it a success? I mean,
well, again, this is why history is so important. We need to understand that the United States has been selling itself as the sole touchstone of democracy and democratic values for some time now. We were the forge of democracy during the Second World War, and when the Second World War ended, we became the leading democracy in the world, the head of the free world. But democracy has always been a veneer. It's fake. It's not real. We don't really promote democracy. We promote the name. But we were able to build this infrastructure, this framework at the end of the Second World War that was based upon the world's largest and strongest military and the world's strongest economy. Now, we had both of those because the rest of the world had basically beat themselves to death, in a global conflict, and we emerged relatively unscathed. And we were able to ride this out. We made a system of rules that benefited us solely, called the rules-based international order, the World Bank, the International Monetary Organization, the United Nations. Everything benefited us, and we wrapped it in this cloak of democracy. When you hear democracy, what you should hear is American exceptionalism, because basically democracy is the fuel that makes the engine of American exceptionalism operate. And it's not real democracy, it's just the notion of democracy. And trust me, we don't really believe in it. I mean, Jeane Kirkpatrick wrote a paper in 1979, got published in Foreign Affairs magazine, in which she pretty much said, look, we pick the friends that suit our policies. We don't necessarily pick the friends that are most democratic. It'd be nice if they were, but we're not too worried if they're not. If the bottom line is we need people who will help us in this global struggle against the Soviet Union. And now the Cold War ended, and we're in a position now where we continue to use democracy as an excuse to do things. We invaded Iraq to bring democracy to the Iraqi people. We've done this over and over again. So what Joe Biden's done now is he had a political problem. How do you breathe life into this system that served the United States for decades? Using democracy as a fuel to promote American exceptionalism. After 4 years of Donald Trump, the world had lost faith, and from Biden's perspective, Trump was responsible for the degeneration of democratic values here at home, January 6th, et cetera. So, Biden has said that democracy is that upon which his Build Back Better plan will operate. I mean, you need democracy, democratic values, and it's not just Build Back Better here at home, but it's Build Back Better abroad. And so that's what's behind this. It's not about democracy. I mean, it's a joke. This isn't about spreading democratic values. This is about reinvigorating the system of American hegemony that uses the theory of democracy as a means of ensuring that the United States is in charge. The United States is calling the shots. And again, we've used this concept of democracy to face off against the new communism. We don't call it communists anymore. They're autocrats. China, Russia. These are autocratic powers that are challenging American democracy at home and abroad. And so that's the purpose of this. It's purely a a show. It's not about democracy. And guess what? It's going to fail because there's nothing of substance backing it up. It's, he's using the same model that Barack Obama used for the national security strategy. Not national, the nuclear security summit that he held. And we were talking about, promoting non-proliferation values. Instead, nothing happened. Here we have a summit for democracy, talk about promoting democratic values. Nothing's going to happen. It's going nowhere. It will fizzle away. They won't be talking about this summit in 2 years.
It really did seem like kind of a physical manifestation of Madeleine Albright's book on fascism, where even if there are no real ideological conflicts, the way that there were during the original Cold War between the US and the Soviet Union, Madeleine Albright is basically saying everybody I don't like who won't do what I want is a fascist. And so she's divided up the world into two camps in a very Manichaean fashion between the democratic allies and the autocrats or authoritarian states. And authoritarians are fascists, and Israel is, not even included. And I'm not sure if she mentioned Saudi Arabia in her book, but it really was a good way of looking at the kind of thinking that animates most U.S. secretaries of state these days. Certainly the way that Blinken views the world. And it mostly just seemed like some kind of attempt to not only deploy democracy, but to weaponize human rights. And I noted that in the day ahead of the conference, Tony Blinken established this independent journalism fund, which is anything but independent, because if you're on the State Department dole, you are not independent, to support journalists around the world, especially in countries where the U.S. seeks regime change, and to basically use them as geopolitical or imperial pawns, which actually puts journalists at risk. It taints the journalistic profession, and it aims to use them kind of as, chess pieces in this geopolitical gambit, where if the quote unquote regime, the autocrats, harm them or take down their outlet, then the U.S. levies sanctions. And that's what's likely to happen. I mean, we've seen it in Nicaragua, where Ben is, where the U.S. was paying media to whip up regime change operations. So it seems like that will be one of the outcomes of this conference, is to escalate that kind of information warfare and the weaponization of human rights.
Sorry, Scott, you were muted. Go ahead.
Well, I'm just saying that we've been doing this for years, though. It's we've been, if you go back into the 1950s and 60s, the CIA, specialized in buying off foreign journalists and creating its own media outlets to promote intellectual discourse, et cetera. And now today, the hand in glove relationship between the major media networks and any presidential administration. I mean, the bottom line is the White House drives the news cycle. Everybody knows this, so you have to get in bed with the sources of your story. And if you're not in bed with them, keeping them happy, they're not going to feed you the information that gives you the headlines. So, this is just a fact. So it's not just how we exploit information. You talked about human rights as well. The United States has been using its singular status as the sole remaining superpower to impose conditions-based diplomacy on nations around the world, meaning that we will provide you aid so long as you do what we want you to do. And we couch it in terms of human rights, but it's really not about real human rights. It's about, again, the rules-based international order and your fealty to that, which means your fealty to the United States. But it's backfiring now because there are now alternatives out there. There are nations out there that don't put these moralizing conditions on aid. It's purely an economic relationship. China leads the way, and an example of this is Ethiopia. We helped put in place this new prime minister. We helped give him a Nobel Peace Prize to elevate his status, and now he has a civil war in place. And when civil wars occur, bad things happen, atrocities occur, and he's no longer popular. So we're sanctioning him. And one of the ways we're sanctioning them is to withdraw from this agreement that was put in place in 2000 that helped promote, for instance, in case of Ethiopia, in the Horn of Africa region, apparel manufacturing. I mean, Nike shoes and shirts and everything are made over there, and it's a big deal. It helps employ people, et cetera. Well, we're going to kick them out of that now, which means that there's going to be hundreds of thousands of Ethiopians unemployed, except they won't be, because China has just stepped in. They have a 10-year agreement to buy $300 billion worth of goods from Ethiopia in the area. So they're stepping in and doing what and China doesn't come in and say, you have to now embrace autocracy. You have to praise the autocrats. You have to call yourself an autocratic regime. They're not doing that. They don't care.
Or specifically,
All China
Scott,
wants is the money.
Yeah, China doesn't come in and say you have to cut the minimum wage, you have to cut, paid leave, you have to, as Hillary Clinton did in Haiti, you have to make sure the minimum wage stays at 30 cents an hour. Like, no, there's no conditions. No
conditions. You do what's best for you, as long as you meet the contractual obligations that we've negotiated in good faith. And China's not, out there to do things for other people. I mean, China's out there to do it for themselves. But the bottom line is, when China sits down at the table, all the cards are on the table. You know what you're getting into. And then you have to decide whether or not you want to do it. With the United States, there's the economic aspect of it, but then there's the whole moralizing human rights aspect of it that oftentimes undercuts what you're trying to accomplish economically. So again, the American model is failing because the world has changed. The world is a more mature place, a more capable place. Nations are capable of standing on their own, and we now have a serious competitor out there that can match us anywhere on the globe in terms of economic projection, and that's China.
I don't know if you have any time to stay with us any longer, Scott, but if you do, I just wanted to get your quick thoughts on the NDAA, which looks like another budget buster. And I don't know if we'll be buying any parts for the high-tech piece of sky junk known as the F-35, but it doesn't, it's just like garbage rotating around the earth, but if it can fly at all. But do you have any thoughts you want to offer?
The American military budget is an embarrassment. It's a national embarrassment. I'm all in favor of a strong military. I believe in self-defense, and I believe that sometimes self-defense requires you to go on the offense. So, and I also don't believe in a fair fight. I had the uniform on myself, and the last thing I wanted to do is get on the battlefield with somebody who could kill me. I'd prefer to get on the battlefield where I can kill them and only them and win every time I fight. And to do that, you need high technology, you need highly trained troops, you need well-paid troops, you need educated troops. So I'm all about spending the money necessary to do this. But, we're spending $760+ billion, and we have a military that's getting worse every year. And one of the reasons is that we don't know how to buy equipment. The F-35 is a shining example of that. I would say that virtually every piece of equipment that the United States buys, look at the USS Gerald Ford aircraft carrier. Doesn't work. Can't, instead of sticking with the technology that works, the old compressed air catapults. No, we had to go with some high-tech, a railgun mechanism. Doesn't work. Can't launch our planes. Nothing works.
It's like how Gerald Ford used to always fall down the stairs.
Yeah, so now we have an aircraft carrier that does the same thing. But it's not just that. We emphasize technology over the exclusion of efficiency. Today we are totally dependent upon satellites to do everything. We communicate. They pass all our data. They crunch data. They think for us. Yes, that makes us a very efficient military when we're taking on goat herders in Afghanistan. But when we want to fight the Chinese or the Russians, the first thing they're going to do is look in the sky and say, all those satellites that make you so efficient, they're gone. And now what are you going to do? So we're building a military that can't fight. The only thing the military is good for today is putting money in the pockets of the military-industrial complex. And this is the problem. Again, I'm all about building and maintaining a strong military. We don't have one today. We have an embarrassment. It's a joke. It's a laughing stock. And that's dangerous because we're out there with diplomats like Tony Blinken who are acting as if we're tough guys. We're not that tough anymore. I mean, I'm not denigrating the individuals who are in the military, but you don't win wars as an individual. I mean, the Army can speak of, the army of one all they want. No, you need an army of 100,000 that know how to fight together and have trained to fight together. We can't do that. And it's not, we're tying our hands everywhere. So the NDA is a joke. If Congress was doing its job, you could actually sit down and come up with a budget that was $200 to $300 billion less than the one you have now, and have a military that functions in a far more effective way. Russia only spends $50-60 billion a year, and they've put in place a military that can kick our butt. That's got to tell you something.
Yeah, and Russia recently cut their military spending.
Yeah.
Well, Scott, I don't know if there's anything you want to add in closing, but this has been really informative for everyone, and just another great discussion.
Well, I thank you very much for having me. It was an absolute pleasure to be on with you guys. Sorry about the technical difficulties early on.
No problem. I mean, we like to keep it retro and real. You're definitely the real deal. I mean, you bring so much gravitas to the conversation. So where can people find your work? I know you write regular columns for RT, and you maintain a pretty strong presence on Twitter. Where can people find you these days?
That's the big thing right now. I use Twitter. You got to thank my daughter for that, because I had no clue what Twitter was until she said, "No, you got to get on Twitter." And now I post my articles on Twitter, and that's pretty much it. I use Twitter. I need to learn more about this social media thing and what a social media footprint is, but Twitter's it right now.
Right on. It's a good place to waste time and not read books too. So
yeah, everyone can follow Scott at real Scott Ritter.
Yeah, that's my take on Donald Trump. I was mocking Donald Trump when I made that. So I just lost all the conservative followers I had.
Well, he's gone. Twitter got rid of him, so you're the only real account left.
I'm it.
Until they get rid of you too. I think we've had several guests who've had their Twitter accounts nuked for pretty much no reason. You might know a few of them. We'll all be Twitter refugees at some point. So anyway, thanks again, Scott. Great to see you, and best of luck.
Well, thank you very much. Thanks for having me, and good luck with you with all your endeavors as well.
For sure.
Thanks, Scott.
Take care. So yeah, Ben, you are in Nicaragua. I'm not. And Nicaragua has its foreign ministry has made a major announcement today that will probably reverberate on the world stage. You might have been the first person to announce it in English. So what's going on?
Today, December 9th, Nicaragua officially cut ties with Taiwan, which is a huge deal. This is a very significant decision in Nicaragua. Nicaragua, after the Sandinista Revolution in 1979, it did recognize the People's Republic of China in 1985. But then what happened is that when the Sandinistas lost power in 1990, and the U.S.-backed right-wing president Violeta Barrios Chamorro from the Chamorro oligarchy, when she took power, she was basically just an empty slate who would do whatever the U.S. told her to do. The U.S. pressured her immediately in 1990 to break ties with the People's Republic of China and to recognize Taiwan. So since 1990, Nicaragua has been one of only a dozen countries in the entire world that still recognize Taiwan as an independent country. But today, December 9th, Nicaragua officially cut ties with Taiwan, officially announced that it only recognizes the People's Republic of China as the only representative of China, and Taiwan being part of China. And immediately, like 2 hours after this was announced at 4:30 p.m. Nicaraguan time, and 2 hours later, the spokesperson of China's foreign ministry, Hua Chunying, announced that China is holding talks with Nicaragua. So, I mean, this was clearly something planned. This is a very big deal. And it's also a big deal, not only because this is part of the new Cold War, and like I said, only a dozen countries in the world recognize Taiwan as an independent country, but it's also a very big deal because we've seen reports in the past few weeks that Nicaragua and this Chinese company are going back to building an interoceanic canal. And you can bet right now that the United States is losing its mind, freaking out, because not only did Taiwan just lose one of the only allies it had remaining in the world, but now it's very clear that in the next year or two, they're going to restart construction of an interoceanic canal. What does that mean? That means that the US-dominated Panama Canal has a competitor, which means that China, Russia, Iran, any country that wants to do business with South America, that wants to do trade going through from the Pacific to the Atlantic, can now go through what will likely be a Nicaragua canal that will be bigger than the Panama Canal, that might even allow multiple ships to go through at the same time. And unlike the Panama Canal, will be a sovereign project that is controlled by the Sandinistas, a revolutionary socialist anti-imperialist movement. Whereas, let's not forget, in Panama, the Panama Canal, which was created by the U.S. after the U.S. basically carved off Panama from Colombia. Panama was basically a kind of U.S. colony. Don't forget that the U.S. government invaded Panama. And there's not much discussion of why the U.S. government invaded Panama. Now, the excuse given by the U.S. government was that the U.S. had to invade Panama because Noriega, the former president, was a dictator and he was drug trafficking and he was corrupt and all of this, which is hilarious because Noriega had been a CIA ally. Like,
let's not say ally. He was playing all sides. He was an opportunist, and he definitely had worked with them. But basically, Noriega was a complete opportunist in that respect. I don't want to go too far.
Yeah, I mean, he was involved in the Contra operation, helping smuggle drugs so that the CIA could fund the Contras with drug money. But the irony is that he outlived his usefulness, and then the U.S. invaded Panama in 1989 and overthrew him. But what's not discussed is that the significance of that invasion was also the U.S. invaded right before the Panama Canal went back to being owned by Panama. So it was also a way to prevent Panama from exercising sovereign control over the Panama Canal because the U.S. didn't trust Noriega because they had been using him to smuggle drugs and they knew that he was an opportunist who could go in different directions.
Well,
so now
he was also seen by U.S. intelligence as overly nationalistic. He was appointing people in his cabinet who were Black Panamanians who were nationalistic as well, and maybe too left wing. So there were the politics were getting out of control. And as we talked about before, the U.S. was sending a message to Nicaragua ahead of its 1990 elections.
Absolutely. So the fact that China now has official diplomatic relations with Nicaragua is huge. It also comes at the time when in Honduras, the left-wing Libre Party and the candidate who won the election, Samara Castro, she has said that if she said before the election that if she won the election, she would recognize the People's Republic of China. So that means that very likely Honduras is going to break ties with Taiwan and recognize China. And it comes at an incredible moment because this is at the same time as this so-called Summit for Democracy, in which the U.S. invited Taiwan to participate, which is a clear act of aggression against China. I mean, Biden claims one day that he recognizes the one China policy, and then he invites Taiwan to this democracy summit alongside sovereign countries, acting as though Taiwan is independent. And let's not forget what's an incredible, I mean, these U.S. diplomats continue to shoot themselves in the foot. Guatemala was not invited to the U.S. Summit for Democracy. Guatemala is not even a left-wing country. It has a right-wing corrupt government, but the U.S., the Biden administration has taken this Central America policy of putting a lot of diplomatic pressure on not only Nicaragua, but also on Guatemala and on El Salvador. So the U.S. didn't invite Guatemala, which is going to anger Guatemala. And if Honduras and Nicaragua recognize China, Guatemala will be the only remaining country recognizing Taiwan. So they're also very likely going to recognize China. China's probably going to build an interoceanic canal through Nicaragua. I mean, Central America could very well soon become a key part of the Belt and Road Initiative and a key region that's an ally of China. I mean, we're seeing a huge development in the new Cold War right before our eyes, and you can bet that in Washington they're freaking out right now.
And Bukele was flirting with China last year before he kind of fell back into the U.S. camp. He's playing all sorts of games with Washington. He's seen as overly nationalistic. Honduras, we talked about Honduras before. I mean, we saw Xiomara Castro congratulate or accept congratulations from Taiwan's government. I don't think they're going to follow Nicaragua right away, but the card, I mean, they can play that card if they really want to go there.
Yeah, well, speaking of today, I mean, today, December 9th is a huge day because, I mean, it's in the history of Central America, it's going to go down really remembered. So not only is this the day where Nicaragua's Sandinista government broke ties with these ads, make it impossible to look at an article. So not only did the Sandinista government break ties with Taiwan, but also this is the same day where the U.S. formally accused El Salvador of negotiating with gangs, and the U.S. imposed sanctions on El Salvador today. So the U.S. has been talking about this. The U.S. imposed several rounds of sanctions today on Nicaragua. Here's an article that is actually visible. U.S. targets El Salvador officials in latest group of international sanctions. So on the same day, the U.S. did not invite Guatemala to its democracy summit, and they didn't invite El Salvador or Nicaragua. And Nicaragua broke ties with Taiwan, and the U.S. imposed sanctions on El Salvador. And I mean, Bukele is a mess. Like, this guy doesn't know what he's doing. I mean, he continues to recognize Juan Guaido as fake president of Venezuela, and he continues to constantly criticize Nicaragua. So he's alienating his potential allies. But at the same time, the U.S. There wasn't even a U.S. ambassador. The top U.S. diplomat in El Salvador recently left the country. The U.S. State Department withdrew their diplomat in El Salvador. So right now, the U.S. has no formal diplomatic presence in El Salvador. The U.S. is imposing sanctions on El Salvador. And last year, El Salvador announced that it had a $500 million non-reimbursable agreement with China. So China was giving $500 million for free. When they say non-reimbursable, that means that you don't have to pay China. This is free money. And China is building huge new buildings in the capital in El Salvador. So, I mean, the U.S. continues to they're not even using carrots. They use sticks to punish and attack these countries in Central America that support the U.S., like El Salvador and Guatemala, which is pushing them further into the arms of China. And now the Sandinistas are working with China. So, like, I mean, it's incredible to see. I don't know what they're thinking in Washington. Honestly, it's even from the perspective of U.S. imperialism, these are genuinely insanely stupid policies that the U.S. is taking, and they're pushing Central America into the arms of China, which is going to be great for the world, but bad for the U.S.
Well, let's talk about the canal really quickly. I think this is the most significant issue. The canal was going to link the Atlantic, I guess it would be the Bluefields area through
which is the eastern Atlantic coast,
through a freshwater lake, which is home to the island of Ometepe, one of the most one of the most famous tourist sites in Nicaragua. It's a volcanic island inhabited by mostly indigenous people. Some of the roads there are recently built. This freshwater lake surrounding it used to be home to some of the only freshwater sharks in the Western Hemisphere until an agreement between the neoliberal government in the 90s and the government of Japan that gave them fishing rights. And so goodbye freshwater sharks. And there was a lot of community opposition when the Sandinista government came in, working with a Chinese businessman to propose this canal, and some of the earth moving equipment was brought in starting around, I think, 2010, 2011. And all of a sudden, a campesino movement developed to oppose this project, led by a woman known as La Chica Ramirez, Francisca La Chica Ramirez, who was always followed around by these human rights lawyers like Vilma Nunez, who is funded by the US. And it was pretty clear that this was a US project. This movement would come down. They had ferocious protests. They would, sometimes attack the workers laying the groundwork for the canal. And they wound up becoming the street muscle for the tranques, the blockades that really tore Nicaragua to shreds in 2018. So the 55 days of kind of bloodshed, protests, roadblocks that strangled Nicaragua's economy, reduced its GDP to basically its economic growth to zero in 2018, and resulted in the deaths of maybe some 300 people. That really started and emanated from the canal and this area around Ometepe, which is in Estado Rivas, and in this state, Rivas state, that's close to the Pacific. So a lot of people, I think, might think this is insignificant, but this is, I think, the biggest issue. And the U.S. was clearly involved in opposing it, exploiting legitimate environmental concerns of the local community and ramping up the conflict. And I wonder if we're going to see a reignition of that conflict, because obviously if Nicaragua is able to provide transit for massive shipping, like all the shipping that takes place from the Atlantic that needs to go to the Pacific, rendering the Panama Canal superfluous, I mean, that's a game changer. And if China is controlling that canal or has an interest in it, right in what the U.S. considers its backyard, where Ronald Reagan once said a Soviet tank invasion of the U.S. would be launched. It really does seem like something's brewing there. And so I guess my question for you is, like, will they even take it that far, and what would the U.S. do?
Well, it's not the 1980s anymore. It is, we were saying earlier that it's more of a bipolar world than a multipolar world, but the U.S. can't do a contra-terrorist war against Nicaragua like it did in the 1980s. I mean, they could try. They can't invade. They do have the Palmarola Air Base, Sotacano Air Base, in military base in neighboring Honduras, which is the largest U.S. military base in Latin America. And we did a report on that at the Gray Zone, which you can find. Max and I went there in Honduras. But the reality is that the situation is very different now. And I think it's very possible that Russia might send troops. Russia might send military forces to Nicaragua to protect Nicaragua like it did to Venezuela. And this is not the 1980s. And China very likely will not send troops. China does not have a history of doing that kind of thing, but Russia does. And let's keep in mind, in the past few weeks, I knew something was brewing because there's been a drip of incredibly important news stories about Nicaragua. Here's an article in Sputnik from November 26th. And it says Russian banks are funding the expansion of the international airport in Nicaragua. So when they announced that, I was like, something must be coming, because Russia is going to help expand Nicaragua's international airport. And then a few days ago, a bombshell story broke, which is massive. Russia and Nicaragua announced on December 7th that they're working together to develop nuclear energy in Nicaragua. So, this is huge. Like, there's no nuclear energy in Central America. So obviously, creating nuclear energy is a step toward potential nuclear weapons, which, that's a long way away. Who knows if that's going to happen? But it's clear that Russia and China are telling the U.S. that we are going to protect Nicaragua. And if you look at this map here of the canal that is being built, you can see here near where it says Masaya in the map, that's the town near the capital, which is the red dot at the top, which is Managua. And you can see the blue plane is the only international airport right now in Nicaragua. But if they build the canal, they're going to build another international airport in Rivas, right near the canal, which, I mean, not only economically is this going to totally remake Central America, which is one of the poorest regions of the world, which, by the way, will also help to stop the mass migration to the U.S. of refugees, because they'll probably come to Nicaragua looking for work. It's also going to help stop with the violence and the gangs, because there's going to be more economic opportunities. So not only will this be a game changer for Central America, but it's also going to be a game changer for international politics. And if Russia develops nuclear energy in Nicaragua, and potentially even, who knows, stores nuclear weapons in Nicaragua, I mean, we're talking about like a massive geopolitical tectonic shift.
Yeah,
that's kind of far, but like
that's a little bit far-fetched, but we're already seeing developments that I think have accelerated much more rapidly than I would have expected a few years ago. And this all, I mean, I think this has to do with the U.S. Pushing Nicaragua too far, and them being able to actually use leverage. I mean, we're seeing what a multipolar world looks like, where small independent countries can actually exercise some leverage against what remains the major superpower still, at least the military superpower. And they're willing to do it because the U.S. has pushed them so far.
Absolutely. And you mentioned a key point, that in the 2018 coup attempt, the canal was one of the main points that the right-wing opposition was using against the government. Here's a long article I published, a very long article at the Gray Zone, about the former revolutionaries turned right-wing opposition figures from the so-called MRS party, which changed its name from the Movement for the Renovation of Sandinismo. They now call themselves the Democratic Renovation Union and UNAMOS. And this is the article: From Nicaraguan Revolutionaries to U.S. Embassy Informants, How Washington Recruited Ex-Sandinistas like Dora Maria Tellez and her MRS party. But one of the things I point out in this article is that the MRS party helped organize protests against the canal, using xenophobic rhetoric, claiming that Nicaragua was selling itself out to China. And this is ironic because this is at a time when Nicaragua didn't even have formal relations with the People's Republic of China like it does now. And they had these protests. And if you look at this sign, I don't know what it says in Chinese, but in Spanish it says Chinese out. It doesn't say China out, because China in Spanish is China. It's fuera chino, which means Chinese out. It's this very xenophobic rhetoric. We don't want any Chinese people. They also wrote, here you can see in this tweet from this party, UNAMOS, which is this US-backed party of former Sandinistas who all became right-wing coup plotters. They said, we will not allow a Chinese invasion. So this is the rhetoric they were saying back in 2014. So you can bet this kind of rhetoric is going to be amplified. And it's the same thing we saw in Myanmar. In Myanmar, there were these protests, these so-called protests recently, where after there was a coup, and the military government in Myanmar is seen as being more pro-Chinese. And there were protests in which these people were chanting Chinese out, no more Chinese, and they were targeting Chinese infrastructure projects as part of the Belt and Road Initiative. So, I mean, of course, the U.S. is absolutely going to amplify its meddling in Nicaragua. But, I mean, what can they do at this point? All they can do is impose more sanctions on Nicaragua. But that's why Nicaragua is breaking ties with Taiwan and recognizing China, because Nicaragua is saying to the U.S., fine, if you're going to impose a blockade on us, like the blockade in China, or on the blockade in Cuba and the blockade in Venezuela, fine. We're just going to do business with China.
Yeah. And the Taiwanese government has also made a major miscalculation in trying to ramp up conflict over the Taiwan Strait, pushing the U.S. to the Taiwan lobby in Washington. By the way, Bob Dole died at age 98. He was a lifelong smoker. I guess, as the French say, the smoke cures the fish, because he lived so long. He was a tobacco lobbyist, but he was also the key figure in constructing the Taiwan lobby in Washington. And the Taiwan lobby has been working overtime to push the U.S. for recognition in a similar way that the Ukrainian lobby has been pushing the US to intervene, and they miscalculated badly. Of course, they're not going to get that. And what we're seeing with what Nicaragua is doing is the de-recognition of Taiwan all around the world. Just this complete rejection from countries that have stood with them through thick and thin. And I should say, like, Taiwan provided, valuable goods. I mean, they're a major export engine, and they were providing everything down to police gear to Nicaragua. And Nicaragua was willing to dispense of them. So I think that this just reflects how extreme Taiwan's government is and how much the Taiwan lobby is failing.
Yeah, and people have been asking me why the Sandinistas had recognized Taiwan for so long, and really briefly, I'll explain. So, like I said, the Sandinistas, after the revolution in 1979, in 1985, they recognized the People's Republic of China. And then in 1990, the right wing came into power after a decade of the contra-terrorist war backed by the CIA, and then also a U.S. blockade of Nicaragua, which caused tons of economic problems. So basically, the U.S. held a gun to the collective head of the Nicaraguan people and said, if you don't vote for the right wing that we fund, that we trained, that we're giving press coverage to, and we're writing all the press releases for them, if you don't vote for them, then we're going to continue terrorizing the country. So the people of Nicaragua were tired, and they voted in the right wing of Violeta Barrios de Chamorro, who comes from the most elite oligarch family. The Chamorros have had 7 different presidents in the history since Nicaragua, the modern republic, was founded 150 years ago. And since then, Nicaragua has had relations with Taiwan. What happened in 2007? Well, in 2006, the Sandinistas won democratic elections, and they came back to power. But when they rebranded in the elections in 2006, the Sandinistas were slightly more moderate. They rebranded as a kind of like very Christian, progressive, liberation theology movement that was not as revolutionary and radical. And they decided to more gradually implement changes. So immediately they implemented free healthcare and education and housing programs and jobs programs. But in terms of foreign policy and some of their other policies, economic policy, they were more gradual in implementing policies because they were afraid of really angering the U.S. empire. But they joined the ALBA, the Bolivarian Alliance, along with Venezuela and Cuba and Ecuador and other countries, and they were pushing a progressive foreign policy. But one of the holdovers of their foreign policy from the neoliberal era, which was from 1990 until 2007, was their relations with Taiwan. Now, why did they wait from 2007 until now? I mean, a few things. One, as Max said, Taiwan was offering a lot of investment. Taiwan does this to Central America because Guatemala and Honduras are 2 of the only remaining countries on earth that recognize Taiwan. El Salvador, until recently, the FMLN leftist government in El Salvador broke ties with Taiwan and recognized the PRC. But Taiwan offers a lot of money to Central America, which is one of the poorest regions of the world. So, hundreds of millions or billions of dollars of investment in Central America goes a long way, considering the GDP of many of these countries is only a few $1 billion. They're very small countries and small economies. So in the case of Nicaragua, one of the biggest factors in the Sandinistas being hesitant to waiting so long to cut ties with Taiwan is that during the neoliberal era from 1990 until 2007, a lot of Taiwanese companies invested in Nicaragua, and there were potentially tens of thousands, or maybe I've even heard hundreds of thousands of jobs that were linked to Taiwan from either Taiwanese companies or companies that came in deals that were brokered by Taiwan. So the government was wary of breaking ties with Taiwan because it means that it could potentially lose tens of thousands or maybe even over 100,000 jobs. And of course, most of the people working in these jobs are working class people who support the Sandinistas, who vote for the Sandinistas. So if they lose their jobs, they might be angry at the Sandinista government. So the Nicaraguan government clearly made a decision that the U.S. refuses to recognize our elections, so screw it. We don't even care about, winning the approval of the U.S. or the OAS. Nicaragua's leaving the OAS. They already announced that. So screw it. We're going to lose these jobs in these Taiwanese companies, and unfortunately, that is going to do some short-term economic damage to our economy. But in the long term, China is going to invest much more. So it was a difficult decision. I had been talking to diplomats, doing interviews in the past several years. I had been asking people constantly. I was like, what is up with Nicaragua still recognizing Taiwan? And they said a few things. They said that the jobs were very important. And also Taiwan has invested money. And what happened with that money? The money from Taiwan was given, basically free money from Taiwan, basically just telling Nicaragua, we give you the money and you keep recognizing us. And then Nicaragua used that money to build houses, literally to build houses for poor people. There's a big housing project of very cheap subsidized housing, and that money came from Taiwan. And also another important factor that we should keep in mind is that diplomats would constantly tell me, they would emphasize that, yes, Nicaragua from 1990 until 2021, it has not had diplomatic relations with the People's Republic of China, but the Sandinista Front, as a political party, did have relations. It had formal political relations with the Communist Party of China, and the Sandinista Front has been recently participating, even before announcing that they were cutting ties with Taiwan. Nicaragua was participating, the Sandinista Front, that is, was participating in events organized by the Communist Party of China. This is an article in Nicaragua's main public media outlet, 19 Digital, which it's the 19th is July 19th is the anniversary of the revolution. This is an article from December 1st, and it says Nicaragua participates in a forum by the Communist Party of China. So this was a week ago. So, I mean, Nicaragua the Sandinista Front has had relations with the Communist Party of China, but this is a massive development that is not going to just influence Central American politics. I really think that in the next few years, this is going to be a huge development in the Belt and Road Initiative.
Absolutely. It sounds like the beginning of a major pivot point in Central America. I got to jump off, but I just wanted to raise one more issue about Central America that I think is essential to anyone who's trying to understand the region. And it's from Nayib Bukele, who's wondering if Max Kaiser and Stacey Herbert should be Salvadoran citizens after introducing Bitcoin to the country. So maybe we'll invite Max or Stacey on, or Anya. Anya's had Max on before to address this amazing development. I really would actually like to know more about the El Salvador nationalizing Bitcoin as a currency. But Ben, if you want to stay on and continue the discussion, I got to jump off because it's about that time over here.
Yeah, well, no, I'm going to wrap up. I'll just add a few points and then we can conclude here. Again, I just want to stress this. What we're seeing in Central America right now, people should pay attention. I know it's a small region, but it's important. This is an article from November. U.S. official says El Salvador relations paused for lack of interest. And this is, again, the U.S. didn't even have an official ambassador. They had a charge d'affaires who was there, and she left. Right now, the U.S. has no formal diplomatic relations with El Salvador. The U.S. is imposing sanctions on El Salvador. The U.S. refused to recognize the Nicaraguan elections. And I want to point out, this is not just propaganda. Russia has actually sent troops to Venezuela, which was this was in 2019, in March. This is a month after the U.S. initiated the coup attempt with fake interim president of Narnia, Juan Guaido. I mean, Russia actually has been very clearly warning the U.S., saying that it's not going to tolerate the U.S. invading Venezuela. I think this was an important factor. Here's another article in September of 2019 in Reuters. Russian military specialists arrive in Venezuela to service equipment. I don't think it's actually, I mean, the nuclear arms thing, I don't think that's going to happen. But I mean, I just raised that. Who knows where things could go. But I actually do think that there's a very real possibility that Russia could potentially send military advisors to Nicaragua. In fact, right now, as we speak, there's an important high-level Nicaraguan delegation in Russia. So not only did Nicaragua announce today that they're recognizing the People's Republic of China, this article was published today, December 9th. Russia and Nicaragua strengthen bilateral ties on nuclear and other issues. So Nicaragua is very quickly going to become a huge thorn in the side of the U.S. When it comes to the new Cold War, Nicaragua is very clearly going out on a limb. The Sandinistas are saying, we are now the best friend of Russia in Central America and probably going to become an important ally of China. So we constantly at the Gray Zone, we talk about the new Cold War. I mean, Nicaragua has just stuck its neck out and said that, like, we are going to stand up for our sovereignty, and we're going to have two big brothers who are going to help protect us from the U.S. empire that constantly tries to overthrow our government, imposes sanctions on us, meddles in our internal affairs, and we're not going to tolerate it anymore. It's a huge development.
Yeah, and a return to the state of play in a lot of ways prior to the collapse of the Soviet Union. I mean, it was the Soviet helicopters, the Hind helicopters, I'm not sure how to pronounce it, that provided the Sandinistas with the muscle to launch Operación Danto, the final push in the war against the Contras that led to that brought the Contras to the table and led to their defeat. The Sandinista army was trained by Cuba and the Soviet Union. So Nicaragua has always looked for international partners to defend itself against the U.S. empire that invaded it in the 1930s and murdered its national hero, Augusto Sandino. So history repeats itself in a lot of ways, or history strikes back. That's what I'll say. I got to go. I don't know if you want to continue, Ben.
Yeah, we'll wrap up. But thanks for everyone who joined us. We're at almost 2 hours now. Got a lot of great comments. Thanks to all the super chats. I wish we could have
pronounced Hind.
responded
Yeah.
more.
Sorry, Ben. It's a Hind helicopter. Go ahead.
No, I want to thank all the super chats. I want to thank everyone who commented. Thanks to Jonathan Flanders. Thanks to, so many comments here. I wish I could keep track of all the super chats. But thanks to everyone. We will be back in a week. And if you want to listen to this, if you watched it and you didn't catch the beginning or something, you can listen to this over at Moderate Rebels. I'll post this in 2 parts. The first part will be about Ukraine and Russia and NATO with Scott Ritter, and the second part will be a shorter section on Nicaragua, showing what it means to be a sovereign, independent country and standing up for its rights against U.S. meddling. It should be an inspiration for the world.
And thanks to everyone in the chats. I think we might have some, I don't know if they're big announcements, but definitely announcements about some new ventures. So stay tuned. And, I see people clamoring for more Anya and Aaron. So we're definitely going to be incorporating them. And Aaron's in Mexico City right now getting an award that he should have gotten in the United States. But, you can't get an award for challenging power here anymore. So you got to go south of the border for that. Maybe Ben will get one too down there.
Yeah, here's just to give some love to Aaron. This is awesome. He's in Mexico City. He received an International Journalism Award from the Mexican Journalist Club. And you can see here, very cool. So all power to him. And yeah, what's funny is in Latin America, the Gray Zone, we have a big audience. We sending all our love. Les mando nuestro amor, nuestros saludos a todos los compañeros, todas las compañeros ahí en Latinoamérica. We know we have a big audience there. So yeah, we'll keep up our work.
Yeah. And I don't know why Aaron's spending only 24 hours down there, but one of my favorite cities on earth. Look forward to coming down there. Aaron won an award for his Russiagate reporting, in case you're wondering. But we're not doing this for the awards. We're just doing it for the love. So we'll be back next week with another good guest. Peace.
Thanks to Commuted. Thanks for the super chat here. Thanks to Vasca X Tumir. And let's see here. You got some other super chats. Thanks to XXRNXX, old school, like hardcore days, like when all the bands would do like the XX. Thanks for the super chat there. Thanks to Stargazer. Yeah, and we will back next week. So thanks to all the chat. We love you all, not just the super chat. I wish I could highlight other comments, but there are literally thousands of comments. So, all right. Well, this is the 2 hour point. I'll see you all next time. Thanks.